Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club for our book event featuring former Attorney General Eric Holder and best-selling author Sam Koppelman. I'm Mike Balsamo, the Justice and Law Enforcement reporter for the Associated Press and National Press Club Secretary. We are looking forward to a robust discussion today and are happy to take your questions as well from the audience. If you have a question, please write them on the cards on your seat and you can hand them to Kate right there in the back. 2022 may be the year of the gerrymander. States are grappling with population shifts after the 2020 census, and that means legislatures are in the throes of redrawing election maps. Groups on both sides of the aisle have called foul and are taking their cases to the courts. Judges have thrown out Republican-drawn redistricting maps in Ohio, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, and Democratic-drawn maps in New York and Maryland. Republicans have called Democrats' strategy "sue until it's blue." Democrats have called the Republican efforts undemocratic, radically motivated gerrymandering that intends to suppress the votes of minorities and young people. Our guests today have been at the center of this battle for voting rights for years. As Attorney General in the Obama administration, Eric Holder placed voting rights at the top of his agenda and was an outspoken critic of voter ID laws. Now he chairs the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and with best-selling author Sam Koppelman, the former director of surrogate speechwriting on the Biden-Harris campaign, has written Our Unfinished March, The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote, A History, a Crisis, a Plan. The book explores the oftentimes harsh history of the vote, its place at the core of democracy, and its vulnerability. The Voter Rights Act has been under assault since it was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, with the latest salvo coming in 2013 with a landmark ruling in Shelby v. Holder that struck down the section of the law that required some jurisdictions with a history of voter suppression to seek approval from the Justice Department before enacting changes to existing voter laws and procedures. Since then, many states have passed laws restricting the vote. We're delighted to have with us today both Attorney General Holder and Mr. Koppelman to discuss the book and the state of the vote. Gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club. And with that, Attorney General Holder, the podium is yours. Okay, thank you.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that kind introduction. Thanks for having me here. I've been to the press club in quite some time. I'm excited to talk about our new book, Our Unfinished March, and also to talk about our ongoing and continuing fight to save our democracy. So let's start here. Our country has achieved, I think, once inconceivable progress over the course of the life of this nation, and certainly over the course of these last few decades. We elected the first black president and the first black vice president. We have confirmed the first black woman who will sit on the United States Supreme Court. I was the first black Attorney General of the United States. I mean, just one generation after my father was told to leave a whites-only train car while wearing the United States Army uniform during the course of World War II, his son was able to serve as Attorney General of the United States. And that's something. That's progress. Now, that's progress that my parents and generations before would never have imagined, but we need to be extremely clear. That progress did not simply arrive. It was won by those who confronted forces of injustice throughout the history of this nation to make America a better, more equal, and more fair place. It was built by individuals who we talk about in the book, who were committed to our highest ideals. And it was achieved, as it always has been, in the midst of unrelenting and escalating attempts to fight against democracy and against democratic ideals. You know, for as long as America has existed, two opposing forces have clashed over how we express and how we confer the rights and privileges of citizenship. From the founding to slavery, to abolition, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow, those who sought a more inclusive nation have been countered by those who were determined to maintain power at the expense of others. Anti-democracy forces use property and poll taxes and literacy tests, intimidation, and outright violence to achieve their goals. And even after landmark civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation were signed into law, these forces found ways to undermine and to ignore the freedoms that America promised to all of its citizens. Now, I saw these threats up close as Attorney General of the United States. Photo ID laws aimed at suppressing the votes of young people and people of color, voter roll purges that delete millions of eligible voters' names, disproportionately impacting minority communities, polling place closures, and consolidations that vastly increase wait times in minority neighborhoods. Gerrymanders designed with surgical precision to dilute and diminish the voting power of black and brown Americans. Now, these measures were never spontaneous, emotional responses from dispossessed individuals or sporadic efforts to improve election security. Instead, they have been part of a highly strategic, well-funded campaign fueled by powerful interests committed to gutting our democracy. Now, it's a campaign that has only intensified in recent years. Since the day of the last presidential election, lawmakers across the country have introduced more than 400 restrictive election bills in 49 states and passing more than 30 in at least 19 states. Our institutions have been wounded, damaged by a president who spent 4 years abusing his power, and by insurrectionists and their allies who are working to do in state legislatures what they could not do at the Capitol on January the 6th. We are facing an attack on the right to vote not seen since the Jim Crow era. And the question is, what do we do now? Sam and I wrote this book to answer that question in particular, to give you a sense of our history, to give you a sense of the nature of the problem that we confront today, and also to provide some concrete solutions about what do we do next. To provide that larger context for the brutal, bloody, and at times hopeful history of the fight to voting rights, we talked about the history. To show what it looks like to wage a successful battle for democracy, we talk about certain individuals and elevate them, bring them back into the consciousness of people in this country. And to propose a policy playbook for how we can reverse the tides of voter suppression and renew the American experiment, we have specific ideas about things that we ought to consider. And a lot of people have reacted and said, well, you know, you're talking about things that sound too expansive, too big for this nation to do. But that's what defines this country at its best. When we do big, the Great Society, that was big. The New Frontier, the ideas there, that was big. The New Deal, that was big. Eisenhower's successful attempt to build the interstate highway system, that was big. This nation does big. This nation does hard. That is what makes us exceptional. And we need leaders who will think big again and then lead this nation in really substantial ways. The playbook that we talk about includes really two vital categories. First, we have to fix our elections through policies that are guided by one key principle, and that is making it easier to vote. If the United States is going to be truly be a representative democracy, then it needs to represent all of our citizens, and that means all of our citizens need to be able to use their voice, and the way that they use their voice is to vote. No matter who you are, what you look like, where you live, or how many hours you can afford to spend waiting in line, if you are an eligible voter, we must not only allow you to vote, we have to make it easy for you to vote. And think about it. That sounds like a kind of a no-brainer. There are actually people who have said that we should not make it easier to vote. We should make it harder to vote. Test people to see whether or not they really want to overcome obstacles in order to cast a ballot. Every eligible voter deserves a fair, equal, and meaningful opportunity to make their voice heard. That is what we say in our book. Second, we need to reform our institutions, the bedrock of our democracy. And that's no small task, because right now most of our institutions are geared toward maintaining an unjust status quo. We have an unnecessary and anti-democratic electoral college that reversed the people's vote in 40% of presidential elections over the past 2 decades. We have a stolen Supreme Court that has gutted landmark civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation, with more of our fundamental freedoms hanging in the balance. That leaked opinion gives us a sense of where this new court is about to go. We have a warped Senate that concentrates too much power in the hands of an extreme minority of the population. We need to reimagine these institutions so that they live up to their ideals, to ensure that every person has a fair say in the direction of our democracy. I mean, even the House of Representatives, what the founders envisioned as the people's house, is plagued by gerrymandering that locks extreme politicians in and shuts American voters out. The congressional map is as close to even as it has been in a generation, the maps that we have just about finished drawing. And yet the number of competitive seats in the United States House of Representatives is at a historic low. People of color continue to be denied fair representation. Now, some of the ideas that we lay out in our book may sound, as I said, radical, but I have seen enough as a prosecutor, as a judge, and also as Attorney General to know that fundamental change is necessary and that fundamental change is possible. I've seen enough, not just in my career, but also in my lifetime as a black man in this country to know that change, in fact, is possible. And I'm confident that even today we have the power to unleash the promise of our democracy and live up to the values that we all say that we hold dear. And that's what this book is about, to show you how we can channel the courage of foot soldiers for democracy who came before us, build on that legacy in this new century, and take America to the place where we all want it to be. You know, because the truth is that the success or failure of our democracy is not up to me, it's not up to an attorney general, it's not up to the government, it's up to all of us. Every one of us has to stand up for our ideals, every one of us has to speak out for ourselves, and also for each other. Every one of us must recognize our obligations, embrace our power, and act with clarity and purpose, even and especially when it's hard, when it seems like it can't be done. That's the way to make change in this country. That's the way we have made change in this country in the past. I think this country is up to doing it once again. So I want to thank you for inviting us to be here today, and we look forward to interacting with all of you with any questions that you might want to ask.
Thank you, General. I wanted to start with some recent news. So yesterday, a Florida judge struck down parts of Governor Ron DeSantis' congressional district map as unconstitutional. The map dispersed 367,000, African-American voters among 4 different districts. A clear attempt to dilute black voting power and creating a majority-safe Republican districts. DeSantis says he will appeal. So can you, General, give us your analysis of the situation in Florida, which has obviously traditionally been a swing state?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you have to put this in context. Ron DeSantis said that what the Florida legislature was intending to do, the Republicans in the Florida legislature were intending to do, which was a pretty bad gerrymander, didn't go far enough. And so he said, I would veto that which the Republican legislature was going to do. That's not going far enough. I'm going to veto that. And they caved in and passed that which he proposed. A judge has now said that given the situation in Florida, there's an amendment to the Florida Constitution that requires redistricting to be done on a nonpartisan basis. But the judge has said that what the governor's proposed, or what the legislature has put into effect, is in fact inappropriate. It has a particularly negative impact on African American voters in the northern part of Florida. And it is something that we've seen Republicans do in the present day. I mean, Sam can talk about the situation we describe in the book in North Carolina, but it is typical of the problem that we have to call out, typical of the problem that we have to confront. You know, too many Republicans are afraid of the people who they say they want to represent. They want to pick their own voters as opposed to letting citizens choose who their representatives ought to be. And I don't know, Sam, maybe talk about what happened in North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, in the book we read about this student named Love Caesar who was at College of North Carolina and it split the university, the historically black college, in half. And she explained to her classmates that what they were doing was silencing their voices, erasing the power of their votes. And so she went outside in the middle of the night with chalk and drew a line down the middle of campus to show how their power was being divided, how it was being attacked. And it led to all sorts of outraged, people came together, protested. With the help of the Attorney General's organization, the NERC, those maps ended up being thrown out. It was a moment where Republicans, the folks who drew the maps, thought they could get away with silent, intentional, bureaucratic silencing of votes. And because the people responded, those in power were forced to pay attention. So you can overcome this gerrymandering, and it's not just a situation where it hurts our democracy because it makes it so certain voices have more power than others. The other thing gerrymandering does is it makes districts way less competitive by basically making it so there's blowout elections. People are more worried about primaries than they are about the general election. And that's how you end up having bills like the ones that make their way through state legislatures that ban access to choice, because the people who pass them know they're not actually going to be held accountable by the majorities that oppose that kind of legislation. And so the only way you're actually going to get representatives who represent you is by speaking up, speaking out, and protesting those kinds of maps and getting them thrown out in the courts. I mean, you look at sort of the radicalization of these state legislatures, the same ones that then suppress the vote to make it harder for you to vote in the future, to make it easier to get gerrymandered in the future. You enter this democratic doom loop where the people who are getting elected by minorities end up passing laws that increase minority rule, that make it harder and harder and harder to undo that power. It's how you end up with these laws. It's how you end up with representatives like Madison Cawthorn ending up in Congress, truly crazy people who would never otherwise win. And that's the reason that we have to combat them and lead a real.
And I think the important thing about Love Caesar, is that, and I went down to North Carolina A&T, which is the largest African-American, historically black college university in the country. They split that college. They split the campus. Half the black kids here, half the black kids in another congressional district, simply to weaken their power, because taken together, they were a pretty formidable force. So they split them. That's called cracking. Sometimes you pack people together. But that also shows the power of the individual. This notion that, oh, we can't do this. The problems are too big. A young African-American woman named Love Caesar with a piece of chalk, drew that line, exactly where the line had been drawn by the legislature to demonstrate to the students there and to the larger public what actually was going on. We used that data point in our lawsuit and had a judge throw those maps out. The judges, we brought these cases before. One of them described what the Republicans had done there as having drawn discriminatory lines with surgical precision, surgical precision, splitting up a campus. You wake up in one congressional district in a dorm, you go to a class in another congressional district. I mean, think about that. That's what has been done in too many places, but also think about the power of an individual to have an impact in changing that situation.
Thank you. General, you wrote in a column for Time that the Supreme Court's mission had been compromised and that the institution is in need of reform. You cited specifically Shelby, the case that gutted the Voting Rights Act, as the moment that made you realize the court was facing a modern-day existential crisis. What disturbed you particularly about Shelby?
Well, first, that my name is on it. It's like, you called it right. I call it the Shelby County case. I never say Shelby County versus my name. I don't want to be associated with that case. I mean, again, we talk about this in the book. That is, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It is a thing that fundamentally changed politics in this nation. You look at the before and after number of African American representatives at the state, local, and federal level, people call it. You see a huge increase in the number of African Americans who actually registered to vote. African American power, so long suppressed, was unleashed after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the Shelby County case, Chief Justice Roberts says that America has changed. All right, and I wouldn't dispute that. I would not dispute that. But he thinks America, in his opinion, thought America has changed so much there was no longer a need, in essence, I mean, this goes through the particulars, but in essence for an effective Voting Rights Act. And as we note in the book, you saw not years later, weeks later, but hours later, you saw states around the country putting in place voter suppression measures that would have been prohibited had the act stayed intact. And that has had a negative impact on our democracy from the day of that decision up to the present. I actually think that there's a trio of cases that the Supreme Court has rendered that will stand the Roberts Court. It will not show the Roberts Court in a good way. Citizens United, which allowed the free flow of money into our system, Shelby County case in 2013, and then the Rucho case, where the Supreme Court says that federal courts should not be involved in deciding issues of gerrymandering, that those are all political questions. All of this has allowed for anti-democratic, anti-democracy measures being put in place that have a disproportionate impact on people of color. And you couple that, as we say in the book, with the theft of 2 Supreme Court seats. Merrick Garland never given a hearing, he never given many interviews. 200 and something days before the election, it was said that that's too close to the election. And then you go to Amy Coney Barrett, and she's placed on the court while people are voting. So those are 2 seats that could be in the hands of democratically appointed, or would have been made by democratically elected by Democrats. And that would have had a negative, that would have a fundamentally different impact on a whole range of issues. Had Merrick Garland been on the court, we would have had a 5-4 progressive court for about 2-3 years. And a whole number of decisions, including the Shelby County case, might have been decided differently.
The other reason that the Shelby County decision was so outrageous is Congress had reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 3 different times, signed each time by Republican presidents. The last time in 2006, signed by George W. Bush after a 98-0 vote in the Senate, bringing together the likes of Addison, Mitch McConnell, and Hillary Clinton. They both voted for it. And so it was a clear popular mandate. Based on that same evidence, 15,000 pages of evidence, the Supreme Court looked and said, we think America's changed and we're not sure whether there's going to be a new wave of voter suppression. And then what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in the dissent was saying that we don't need pre-clearance because there's not voter suppression right now is like being in the middle of a rainstorm, having an umbrella and throwing it out because you're not getting wet. She understood that the reason that America had changed, the reason there had been progress, the reason our democracy had become a democracy was because of the Voting Rights Act. And the Supreme Court decided to test it. And it's not like it was some kind of a mystery. Literally the next week, that day, Greg Abbott tweeted, like, at Attorney General Eric Holder, basically like, ha, I'm going to go pass this bill. And then they just passed those bills, and then methodically, surgically unwound all of the progress we made over decades. And the Supreme Court hasn't gone back and admitted they were wrong. In fact, Congress has not even gone back and reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in a new way with a new coverage formula. And so we're left without the protections and with the same insidious intent on behalf of Republicans, leaving our country and our democracy in complete shambles.
Yeah, and had the Voting Rights Act been in effect, a whole number of things might not have occurred. The use of these unnecessary photo ID laws that you have to show in some states in order to vote probably would not have been allowed by the Justice Department if it had an intact Voting Rights Act. The closure of polling places, of almost 1,800 polling places around the country, disproportionately in those places that were once covered by the Voting Rights Act, would probably not have been allowed. I mean, there's a whole range of things, and these have real impacts, and you have to understand, in this era of close elections, if you shave 1-2 percentage points off of, say, the African American vote, the perceived Democratic vote, that can have a really dramatic impact on the outcome of elections. And one of the statistics that we can talk about, how long it takes to vote in Atlanta, or that number that we found in Atlanta.
Yeah, it was something like, I forget the exact number, but it was something
I
closer. Do you remember it?
In the 2020 election, presidential election, if you came to Atlanta, a polling place, after 6 p.m., same day, on election day, and you were in an African American precinct, it took 51 minutes to vote on average. If you were in a white precinct in Atlanta, same day, same election, it took you 6 minutes to vote. And so that has a real impact. And so you wonder, well, why did the folks in Georgia pass this law that says you can't give food and water to people who wait in line? Because they knew damn well that the people who had to wait in line were people of color in Georgia. And they want to make it as difficult as is possible for people to simply get to the polls.
And I want to follow up on a point that you made. The Shelby County decision